Hey there guys, how's it going? Back with another video. So, yeah, I'm a little bit late with this one. I caught onto this a couple of days back, and this is something that really took me by surprise, if I'm being honest, this development in boxing. So, according to reports, and I don't know how much truth there is in this, but I've read several reports now that seem to be reiterating the same thing. Apparently, Felix Sturm, former two-division world champion, middleweight and super middleweight, five-time world champion, in fact, is planning to make a comeback. For those of you who don't know, a couple of years back he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, and he's apparently served, I think, 8 months or so of that sentence, but he's been released early, and he's planning a comeback this year. From what I hear, that they're saying he's going to be coming back next month, or if not next month, then in the early part of next year. So I found that quite interesting because it's something that I really didn't expect. Now, I do remember a couple of years back, I think when he was first sentenced, they appealed the sentence, and there was a rumor that he was going to be scheduling a fight with Arthur Abraham, which I was generally quite hyped about. But of course, Abraham ended up retiring, and yeah, that never materialized. So yeah, that just went nowhere. But yeah, he claims he's going to make a comeback, and most of you are probably thinking, why am I covering this? I mean, I've not really been making boxing videos lately, and I don't really tend to cover the idea of potential comebacks and gossip type developments in boxing, and this type of thing I don't usually bother taking the time to talk about. But in regards to Felix Sturm, and long-time subscribers of mine will know that Felix Sturm is one of my personal favourite fighters. And there's a reason why he's one of my personal favourite fighters. Felix Sturm, to me, from my perspective at least, he invokes a certain amount of nostalgia. Now, when I was a young boxing fan, watching the sport growing up, there were obviously domestic level and world level British fighters who I grew up watching. Guys like Ricky Hatton and Joe Calzaghe and guys like that. Even David Hay in the early days, and Carl Froch and so many others. A lot of other British and European level fighters who I sort of grew up watching. And the sort of the coverage of boxing in the UK, you would always hear about those guys before everybody else. So obviously, all the British fighters were kind of the ones who I knew immediately. But I always had a soft spot for German boxing. Like, I remember when I was growing up, I used to be astounded by the contrast in the coverage of fights that would happen in the UK and fights that would happen in Germany, because how it was back then, like the early 2000s to the late 2000s to the early 2010s, how the sort of the boxing landscape was back then. You had, of course, Britain, which was just, because I lived there, I hear about every single development and every single fighter, and I pretty much knew British boxing like the back of my hand. And then, of course, you had the American fights, which was where all the big, pay-per-view extravaganzas were. All the big stuff was in America. But Germany, to me, always had a special place in my heart in regards to boxing, because I always remember watching sort of coverage of German fights with British commentary. And I used to find it so eye-opening, the way that it was covered, and the narrative that you would see pushed from British speaking commentaries in that part of the world. And for me, without a shadow of a doubt, the one guy that sticks in my mind and fills me with the most nostalgia in regards to this is without a doubt Felix Sturm. And the reason I say that is because I remember every time I would watch this guy fight, I watched the guy fight live on several occasions, and every time he would fight, no matter who the opponent was, like whether the opponent was a brawler, whether they were a boxer, whether they were better than him, whether they were several levels below him, it was always the same fight. His fights were always entertaining, they were always back and forth, they were always competitive, and they were always absolute blockbuster type fights. Like, he was one of these fighters, if you look at Felix Sturm in the early stage of his career, so probably way before I started watching him, you look at a lot of his early fights, he was a guy who had great movement, a great jab, very fundamental, had good defense, could box on the back foot and school an opponent, with great movement. And he was just a fundamentally and technically really sound fighter. But in the latter stage of his career, I'd say for most of his championship level career, he was a guy who had a tendency to not really fight to his strengths. To use an example of what I'm talking about, he would have an opponent, right? Let's say he had an opponent in front of him who was more of a flat-footed brawler type. Rather than move around and use the jab and just stick and move and outpoint this guy, what Felix Sturm would usually do is he would stand right in front of them. He would turtle up, he would tighten his guard, tuck his elbows in, and he would sort of invite his opponent in, and he would let these guys tee off on him. He would soak up the punishment, he would roll with punches, he would catch them all on his gloves and his elbows, and then he would fire back. He would fire back with solid uppercuts and hooks, and he would really fuck some of these guys up. And his fights would be back and forth. They would be close, competitive. He would implore his opponents in, let him land some shots on his guard, kind of like Muhammad Ali in the rope-a-dope. And then he would sort of turn his opponents and whack them with uppercuts and hooks around the guard. And he was just such a precise and accurate puncher. Every single punch he threw was thrown with venom and was thrown with proper technique with the knuckle part of the glove and with great accuracy. Like, he would very rarely miss. And I used to be fascinated by that. Like, watching his fights, I would always be on the edge of my seat. I'm like, this is amazing. Like, just go and look at any of this guy's fights, like any of his title defenses, and you'll know what I'm talking about. He was always in those types of fights. If you look at, for example, his fight against Robert Stieglitz, or his fight against Matthew Macklin, or his fight against Sebastian Zbik, or Sebastian Sylvester, guys like that. He was fighting these guys, and he would tuck up tight, like I said, and he would just go to war with them. He would soak everything up on his arms, and he would occasionally get hit in the temple and stuff like that, but he was so durable and tough that he would know how to manipulate the situation in the ring. Like, he would be letting these guys punch themselves out for like a minute and a half, and then for the final minute or so of the round, he would just fuck them up with solid punches, and that was how he was able to win rounds on the scorecards. And that's why a lot of his fights ended up being very close, because, like I said, they were always back and forth, and he had lots of split decisions and majority decisions and very, very close fights. But they were fights that, when you watch them back, because you're watching them live and you think that was really, really close, when you end up watching the fights back, you see what the judges were looking at, because he's just always landing the cleaner shots. Like, I've never seen Felix Sturm in a fight where he didn't land the quality punches. And that sort of brings me to my next point about, why I wanted to talk about Felix Sturm in regards to just my retrospective views on boxing and boxing coverage. Now, I mentioned I had a sweet spot for German boxing, kind of a soft spot I had. Well, part of the reason is that I always found German boxing, and Eastern European in general, but German in particular, because most of the Eastern European fighters that I watched growing up, like the Klitschko's or Felix Sturm or any of those guys, Arthur Abraham and whatnot, they all fought in Germany because that's where the money was. That was sort of the center of Europe. So all the big name European fighters from all over the world would always fight in Germany. It was kind of that was like the powerhouses in boxing. You had the UK, America, and you had Germany. Nowadays, it's only really the UK and America, but back then Germany was a major player in boxing. You had a lot of world champions from Europe that based themselves in Germany. You had big stadium fights over there. It was big business back then. Like, back then, Germany was a big player in the world of boxing. And I always found that German boxing was very counterculture. And the reason I use the term counterculture is because the way that British commentators and British pundits would talk about Germany, and you would see it even on the broadcast, like, let's say, like, Sky Sports or Setanta, they're no longer around. I'm mentioning some old networks now, again, like Sky Sports, Setanta, or ITV or Primetime or whatever, or even Box Nation, which came along later. When you're listening to these broadcasts, and whenever they talk about Germany, or whenever one of these networks or broadcasters picks up a German fight card, you always hear the same narrative. You hear them say things like, "You'll never get a decision in Germany." Or say, "Oh, the German fighters, yeah, they're all boring. They all run and they always lose, but they get gift decisions." And that was sort of the narrative that British casual fight fans had. about Germany because that's what they were told. They were always told that, oh yeah, the fight, you can't get a decision over there. You have to knock them out to get a draw, which, by the way, isn't true. It's never been true. And I will debunk that at one point once I get down to getting myself some better editing software, and I'll show you that a lot of these so-called robberies in Germany were actually myth robberies. They weren't robberies at all, but I digress. But yeah, that was the narrative that we kept hearing, and we kept hearing that all these German-based, like European fighters were all soft, and they were scared of the Americans, and they were scared of the Brits, and basically just fighters from that part of the world were complete dog shit. They were complete garbage, was the narrative that we were being told. That they were fragile and rubbish. And we were always being told that the fights that happen over there are boring. And if you want to see real quality fights, you've got to watch our cards, and you've got to watch cards in America. But what was funny to me is I noticed from very early on, even when I was a young teenager, like I noticed when I watched fights that took place in Germany, the cards to me were always better. Like they were always like I have so many very clear memories of undercards and main events over in Germany, with British coverage, where they turned out to be some of the best fights I've ever seen. Some of the best events I've ever seen in boxing, and I just remember there being a stark contrast to what I was hearing and what I was seeing. And I remember you would watch some of these fighters and you would see comments, like when I first came on social media, and that you would see comments from casual British boxing fans, and they would talk about people like Felix Sturm, and they would say that, oh, he lost all his fights, but he gets gift decisions. You can't get a decision in Germany. You have to knock him out to get a draw in Germany. And you would see that comment just spammed all over the place. And when you go on YouTube and look at some of these fights, and you see people in the comments who haven't watched the fight say that it was a robbery, and that was the type of thing that always kind of it pissed me off. But it always, again, there was something very counterculture about it, about watching and supporting German boxing. And whenever I would watch Felix Sturm, like he was that guy for me. He was one of them guys that the narrative about him being fragile and oh he's shit and he's lost all these fights and his fights are all boring and he gets gift decisions. I knew how much nonsense that narrative was. I mean, to give you a good example, in 2011, and I remember this so clearly, this was, I think, the week before the Klitschko-David Haye fight, which was also in Germany. And I remember in the Felix Sturm Matthew Macklin fight, which was the week before, where you had pretty much everybody, like the entire boxing mainstream media, and everybody on social media calling that fight a robbery. Now, they didn't watch the fight, okay? Hardly anybody even saw the fight. Yet after the fight, because you had all the Sky Sports broadcasters and all the Matchroom Brigade and Sky Sports fanboys and all them types claiming that the fight was a robbery, it basically generated a narrative that the fight was a robbery. But the fact of the matter is, guys, and I'm just going to lay it down here, if you know what you're looking at, right, if you understand how to truly score a boxing match, not only did Felix Sturm win that fight, he beat the shit out of Matthew Macklin. Okay? I mean, Matthew Macklin finished that fight looking like he'd been hit by a fucking train. Okay? He finished that fight looking as if he was a rotten mango or some shit. I'm not even kidding. Like, at the very end of that fight, right, the end of the 12th round, he was one punch away from getting knocked clean out. Right, go and watch the fight. I'm not even kidding. And it was one of them fights, like I said, where Felix Sturm is in the centre of the ring, right? He's turtled up, right? He's got the tight guard. And Matthew Macklin, right, who's a very crude and very one-paced, come-forward pressure fighter, is throwing nothing but slaps and arm punches. He's hitting Felix Sturm's guard, hitting the gloves, hitting him round the back of the head, hitting him round the hips, landing punches sort of around the kidney areas. And, they would either hit the elbow or they would hit sort of the kidneys, and they weren't really scoring blows. And then Felix Sturm, after soaking up some of the punches and blocking and parrying Macklin's slappy, uncoordinated attacks, he would smash Matthew Macklin in the jaw. He would snap Matthew Macklin's head back with the jab. He would snap his head back with the uppercut. He would catch him round the guard with the hooks. He would catch him on the way in and walk him into solid, well-placed power shots that had a visual and clear effect. And you would see Matthew Macklin throughout the fight. He was getting broken down as the fight went on. Felix Sturm was winning the rounds clearer and clearer. Gave away a couple of the early rounds because he just wasn't, taking the initiative. But in the mid rounds to the later rounds of that fight, it became increasingly one-sided. Felix Sturm was catching Macklin with everything. Matthew Macklin had no defense, he had no guard, and he got fucked up. And by the end of the fight, Macklin came so close to getting stopped. I'm telling you right now, if you know what you're looking at, he was seconds away from getting stopped at the end of that 12th round. And let's just say that if you look at Matthew Macklin at the post-fight press conference next to Felix Sturm doesn't have a mark on him. He looks as if he's just been for a jog or something. Matthew Macklin looked as if he'd been hit by a train. I'm not even kidding. He was messed up in that fight. But you had British casual fight fans calling that fight a robbery. You had British broadcasters and pundits, paid analysts, people who are making a living from the sport of boxing, claiming that you can't get a decision in Germany. Macklin was robbed. He dominated it and he never got the decision because Germany, all the judges were German and the referee was German and you can't get a decision in Germany. You have to knock him out to get a draw in Germany. Despite the fact, and this is the funny thing about it, is the fact that, now the fight was for the WBA title, right? None of the officials were German. They were all neutrally appointed officials that were not appointed by Sturm. They were appointed by the sanctioning body, the WBA, which the last time I checked was a Panamanian sanctioning body, not a German sanctioning body. So it's not like the WBA is some German trinket that, that all the supervisors and CEOs and whatnot are all a bunch of krauts. No, it's a totally neutral setup that they have over there. Felix Sturm was his own promoter. So he didn't have a promoter, right? It's not like he has some sort of influence over the officials. It's not like he had any control over that whatsoever. All right, he had a TV deal with one of the networks over in Germany. That's about as far as it goes for it being in-house. All right, all the judges were neutral. One of the judges even gave Matthew Macklin the fight, which was quite shocking. So, I mean, as far as it being a robbery in Germany, that narrative was just flipping disgraceful from a bunch of idiots who don't know what they're talking about. So I digress. Moving on from that. But yeah, that was kind of something I wanted to bring up because it was this narrative that I had to endure for years while I was watching and following British boxing. And in regards to Germany, like I said, it was counterculture because what I was seeing was very different from what I was hearing. And Felix Sturm, he was just one of them guys to me that, and this is another thing that always impressed me about him and makes me have so much nostalgia for him, is because he was one of these fighters who kept coming back. And what I mean by that is, when you thought he was done, he would always surprise you. He had a tremendous amount of resilience. Like, for example, when he would lose his world title, like early in his career, he got knocked out by Castillo. And he came back and won his world title, despite the fact you wouldn't think he would. But in the rematch, he absolutely dominated and he won back his belt. Now, when he went on to lose his title in a close back and forth fight, similar to the Macklin fight, but it was a fight that, stylistically, where he fought Daniel Giel, where again Sturm's like soaking up the punishment and he's firing back, and it was one of them back and forth brawls against Daniel Giel. However, Daniel Giel was a better boxer than Macklin, and he actually did outbox Sturm at times. And yeah, Sturm had regressed a little bit by then. And yeah, Daniel Giel beat Felix Sturm. I remember watching it live and being quite surprised by that. And I thought after watching that, I was like, Felix Sturm is done. Like his career is over. He then went on to fight, I think it was, if I remember rightly, he fought Sam Solomon, and he lost that fight. Again, I watched that fight live, and I remember he dropped Sam Solomon early in the fight. And it was a close fight. I actually thought Felix Sturm won it, and it was in his hometown in Germany too, so I was quite surprised that they gave the decision to Solomon. And I remember quite specifically that night, Michael Buffer I think Michael Buffer made a mistake, because Michael Buffer was the announcer for the fight, and he announced that Sturm won because he thought Sturm had won the fight. But then someone corrected him, and he was like, "Oh no, my mistake." He was like, "The winner is Sam Solomon." And then that was a weird situation because Sam Solomon went on to fail a drug test, and it got overturned. But the fact that Sturm lost the fight to a guy like Sam Solomon, who was pushing 40, it made you think that he was over, like his career was done. But he came back, and I remember he fought Darren Barker. Now, Darren Barker, going into that fight, he had just beaten Daniel Geale, who was the guy who, of course, beat Sturm for the title. So Darren Barker won the title against Geale. And Sturm, I think, became the mandatory. And I remember going into that fight, I remember so specifically going into that fight, everybody was picking Darren Barker. The UK boxing media at the time, the fight was on Sky Sports, and Darren Barker was one of Eddie Hearn's best prospects back then. And they were saying, yeah, he's going to destroy Felix Sturm. Felix Sturm's an old man now in his 30s. He's past his prime. He lost to Sam Solomon. He lost to Geale, who Barker went on to beat. So naturally, Barker's going to beat the crap out of him and probably stop him, right? Well, that wasn't what happened. Felix Sturm destroyed Darren Barker. He went. I remember that fight so clearly. Like, he went out there and he just smashed him in 2 rounds. Beat him up in the first round. He came out. He was very different to his usual style that night. Like, instead of standing there and soaking up the punches, he actually took the lead in that fight, and he was throwing like a stiff jab and a lead left hook, and he was really taking the fight to Darren Barker. And then in the second round, he dropped him midway through the round. He drops Darren Barker with a right hand, and then Darren Barker apparently hurt his hip when he went down, but I still think that the writing was on the wall. Like, even if he didn't hurt his hip when he was knocked down, he still would have got stopped because Felix Sturm was beating the crap out of him from the opening belt. And yeah, in the second round, he was just landing consecutive right hands, and Darren Barker had no answer. So Felix Sturm stopped him. And I remember, again, people were shocked by that. They couldn't believe it because, like I said, Felix Sturm was supposed to be finished at that point. But the fact that he came out and just flattened Darren Barker so quickly, and for years, the British boxing media had been saying that Darren Barker would beat Sturm because Darren Barker also gave Martinez quite a tough fight, and he was a solid British champion and all that, and then he became world champion, and he became world champion in such a great fight against Daniel Geale, who had beaten Sturm. So no one thought that Sturm would win that fight, but he did. He came out and he stopped Barker, so that was really impressive. Then, of course, he goes on to lose the title again in a rematch against Sam Solomon in probably one of his worst performances. Got schooled in that fight. But then, of course, a few years down the line, I mean, he had a few more setbacks. I mean, he lost to Fedor Chudenov. He moved up in weight, and he lost to Fedor Chudenov for the title. Around about that time, he also had a fight against Robert Stieglitz, and that fight was a draw. Could have gone either way, in my opinion, but again, that was a great fight. And he went on to fight Chudenov again in the rematch, and I actually did cover this fight at the time. I did a prediction and a post-fight for it. And Felix Sturm won the fight. It was controversial. I thought Chudenov won the fight, so did a lot of people, but I don't think it was a robbery. I think it was a close fight that could have gone either way, but I did think that Chudenov landed more punches and just outworked the older, more lethargic Sturm. But still, it was a great win for that stage of his career because, again, we all thought he was done. Like, nobody would have thought that Sturm would beat someone like Chudenov, who was a young undefeated champion, who already beat him for the title. So, yeah, to me, there's so much nostalgia with this guy. Like, he's one of them fighters that had so many ups and downs in his career, so many setbacks and trials and tribulations and surprises that he came through. And I just think it'll be quite cool if he makes a comeback. I'm actually really excited about it. So let's see what happens here. This was kind of a trip down memory lane. Another one of these retrospective boxing videos that I like to do. So let me know what you guys think in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and God bless.